Thank you for joining us for today's online editorial summit, Travel's Path Forward, Rethinking Airline Fleets, Routes, and Loyalty. Today's conversation with Skift Airline Weekly and Skift Aviation business editors will focus on how the airline industry is managing this crisis of historic proportion, how airlines are rethinking fleet sizes, routes post-crisis, and cabin configurations, as well as loyalty and customer service reforms, and of course, balance sheet changes. We'll be sharing the recording of this broadcast later today. This online summit is a part of Skift's rapid response of tactical ideas, analysis, and resilience to the industry as it responds to the coronavirus challenge. We're hosting these webinars weekly and highlighting discussions across the industry as it responds. You can view all of our coverage at skift.com, and as a reminder, you can also support Skift's independent journalism at my.skift.com/support. Leading today's discussion will be our editorial team, Senior Analyst, Skift Airline Weekly, Jay Shabbat, Editor, Skift Airline Weekly, Madhu Unikrishnan, and moderating will be Senior Aviation Business Editor, Brian Summers.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. It's good to be here with all of you. I'm Brian Summers. I'm the moderator today. I am joining you from my home office. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to get dressed today, so I appreciate that. You are all in for a very big treat here. Jay Shabbat and Madhu Unikrishnan are great colleagues of mine, and they know just about everything that's possible to know about the airline industry. We talk a lot, so I know that you all are in for a treat. We're going to start here with Jay, who is our senior analyst, giving us a PowerPoint presentation. He's just going to run down some of the issues that he sees as most important during this crisis. Jay, do you want to take it away for us?
Yes, thank you, Brian, for the kind introduction, and thanks everybody for joining. Greetings from sunny Fort Myers, Florida. So yeah, I'm going to start with just a quick overview of sort of a snapshot of what airlines are doing today, kind of how they're sort of navigating the day-to-day crisis. We can just move to the first slide. So airlines are right now, as you know, they're kind of doing, well, they're not flying, which is what they're supposed to be doing, but they're essentially grounded. So what are they doing to try to prepare for the eventual recovery? I'm not going to go through each and every one of the items that we put out on this PowerPoint here. They're mostly for just perhaps will provoke some questions that you're welcome to ask during question and answer time. But I do want to, we wanted to leave more time for just sort of an informal discussion and question and answer. But real quickly, I just want to make sure that it's perfectly clear to everyone that right now, the number one item on every airline's agenda, no exception, is the preservation of cash. So the way to kind of think of airlines right now is, or the whole industry, is that it's basically a boat with a big leak in it, and things are sinking really fast. Cash is flowing out. I think it's safe to say that there's not a single airline in the world right now, passenger airline anyway, that has a positive cash flow. So it's imperative that airlines buy time by making sure that they're preserving or raising as much cash as possible. Next slide. Again, not going to go through each and every one of these. Won't even mention most of them. Have a look at them. Answer questions, please. Just want to emphasize one right now. The number one is lobbying governments. Airlines and their trade associations like IATA and A4A, extremely top priority right now is getting government support, getting relief for emergency funds, just to try to make payroll, to try to alleviate the tax burden. Again, anything with that chief goal in mind of preserving cash. So that's kind of center scene right now, is kind of the halls of government and the lobbying efforts that are underway. That's where the action is. Now, the different governments have done different things so far. The U.S. has been rather generous to the airlines so far. There's still some questions about the details and how that aid is going to be administered and what airlines are going to have to do in return. But for the most part, they've been given a lot of money. Final thing I'll say about governments before moving along quickly is that government policies, in many cases, will wind up shaping or heavily influencing which airlines wind up coming out of this crisis in better shape than others. It could potentially be a big determining factor. So for example, I was just listening this morning to an airline in Brazil, and one of the things they were saying is that, they were urging the Brazilian government to help out a little bit more, provide more payroll funds and other help. And they said, look, we were a really successful airline before the crisis. We were doing really well. We had a healthy balance sheet, but there's no way I'm going to be able to compete post-crisis against American Airlines if they're given, tens of billions of dollars from Washington. So keep that in mind, that government policy is going to matter a lot post-crisis. Okay, again, not going to mention, not even going to talk about the next couple things. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah, obviously, just airlines are, any way they can, they're slashing cost. OpEx just meaning, sort of the day-to-day operating costs associated with the airline. CapEx, the capital expenditures, more of the long-term stuff. Nobody's buying planes right now. Nobody's, putting money into building airport facilities. All of that is completely on hold. Final point about variabilizing the cost base. You guys are welcome to answer questions about that. It's just the idea that, the airline industry tends to be heavily fixed cost. A lot of the costs don't go away even when you're grounded. So airlines are kind of, trying to change that, trying to, discuss contracts with labor and contracts with, other providers of whatever it is, aircraft or capital, whatever. Okay, next slide. Okay. Yeah, just more items to have a look at if you want to ask later. Let's keep going. So that was reassuring customers. You do start hearing just in the last week or two, airlines starting to think about sort of the day after. What's it going to look like once demand starts coming back? And nobody really knows what that's going to look like or when it's going to be. But you hear carriers starting to think that they're starting to identify, what might not we need or what we might want to shed when things come back to normal. So an example would be, I mentioned here, Lufthansa, some of their aircraft were marginal even before the crisis. And maybe it's now a good opportunity to this is, no better time to try to put those down. Another, example is their Eurowings affiliate, if anybody were familiar with that. It's their low-cost unit, never really was very successful. They kind of kept trying to restructure it. Now they're going to do some more restructuring, but also probably in the back of their minds asking the question is, should we even bother keeping this at all? Next slide. Okay. And don't forget that when the time comes to rebuild schedules and to get planes back in the air, they're going to need to have their crews and planes ready to go. And that means, properly licensed and properly trained. Also, they have to make sure that they have enough, financing. If you've got that, leaky boat scenario, as we envisioned in that slide earlier, well, there has to be enough water in the boat in order to pay for the fuel or pay for the, the people that you need to fly the planes and to pay for all the things you need to get back in the air. There was another airline that I was listening to talking about that. They said, yeah, we can survive 90 days. We've got enough cash while our planes are sitting on the ground. But when that time comes, we're not so sure. We may need some government help. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Okay. And I think I'll turn it back to Brian. And yeah, Brian.
Thanks, Jay. That was great. Really appreciate that overview. Now we're going to pivot into something that I used to do when I was a high school debater, where two people take one side of an issue and they debate each other Jay and Madhu are going to give both an optimistic take for how travel might bounce back in the medium term, and then a pessimistic take for why it may not bounce back as quickly as everyone would like. They basically drew these opinions out of a hat. So I don't know that it's necessarily that one believes one side more than the other side, but one's going to handle optimistic and one's going to handle the pessimistic side. So Jay, do you want to get started with this?
Sure, and you can ask us afterwards what we really believe, but right now we're just kind of playing a role. So I'm going to play the optimist, and we can go to the next slide. I'll give you some reasons why the airline industry. Now, let me preface this by saying everybody realizes that we're not going to get back to normal overnight, but there's reasons to be optimistic that perhaps I won't even say a time, but before sooner than later, that things will be back to a state where airlines can, start making a bit money again, and then eventually, leading to longer term, more solid success in not too long from now. So I'm going to start with the number $2 trillion. You may, have seen that number thrown about. $2 trillion is just the money that the federal government allocated as a relief measure for the U.S. economy in what's called the CARES Act, CARES. That's $2 trillion is a lot of money. It's I believe about a tenth of the entire U.S. economy. So just picture everything, all the goods and services the U.S. economy produces, and 10% of that is what the government is going to put in. And that's not the end of it, and it's not the only part of it. There's also monetary stimulus from the Federal Reserve. They're talking in Congress about perhaps putting another $1 trillion. So it's a lot of money that's going to be put back into the economy. And it is a different kind of downturn when you think about it. If you think about the economy as like a machine, normally during a recession, the economy, it breaks in some way. In 2008 crisis, the banking system broke. You can go to different crises in the past where it's one industry or another. In this case, it's really not broken. It's just kind of temporarily turned off. It's an artificial sort of switch off. And no, you can't turn it on overnight, turn it back on overnight. But it is something that perhaps you can get back to normal in an orderly way. Remember that before the crisis, I don't want to talk about just the U.S. here. Obviously, there was different conditions across the globe. But certainly in the U.S., economic conditions are pretty healthy. I mean, low inflation, low interest rates, low jobless rate. So we went into the crisis kind of in a good situation. Airline balance sheets in the U.S. in particular were excellent. Not excellent enough to survive this crisis, but there's no such thing as a balance sheet that could survive this thing. I mean, this was just a huge downturn, but a unique one. There really is a lot of you can imagine there's a lot of pent up desire to travel. Think about all the people sitting home right now. The one way I've heard one analyst sort of put it in a unique way. They said, is demand really destroyed, or is it just delayed? And I think there's a good case to be made that it's just merely delayed. People are going to want to visit their families again. People are going to want to get away from their kids after being with them in the house for whoever knows how long. People are going to want to go travel. So it's there. The demand's going to be there. And yes, there are going to be, there's no doubt that people are hurting economically now badly. I mean, we see those in the jobless numbers. We see these even just anecdotal evidence from our friends and family, and but with all the money that's there, there's a lot of efforts underway to try to to ease the pain through government money and through other measures. So there are going to be people and companies and groups that wind up coming out ahead. That's always true in any downturn. One example would be retirees who are living off of Social Security money and who are accustomed to travel. Well, Social Security checks aren't going away. They don't have jobs to lose in many cases, and they'll in fact they'll be getting stimulus checks in the mail. So there'll be some people with more income. In fact, demographics like seniors who have a lot of time and money to travel. Some of their preferred leisure travel options might not be an option anymore, and cruises come to mind. They may just not be operating for a while. So instead of hopping on a boat, people hop on an airplane. Next slide. Okay. Let's talk about input costs. If you're an airline, you look at jet fuel prices right now, and you've got to, makes you smile. I mean, it's jet fuel prices are extremely, extremely low. Will they bounce back up when demand bounces? Maybe, but there are other factors that are keeping prices low. Aircraft prices too should be very low. Labor costs may wind up falling. So you may not, even if demand is depressed relative to where it was before the crisis, that may not matter, because you might be able to make money at very low airfares. So you can charge very cheap airfares, fill up your planes, and still make a lot of money. That's the kind of the beauty of jet fuel, low jet fuel prices in particular. But when all your major input prices are low, well, that's a reason to be optimistic, I think. It really is the best time. Crises are the best time ever to restructure kind of old costs that you wanted to reduce. And there's no better, I mean, this crisis especially, because if you think about it, every stakeholder in the industry, none of them have any kind of bargaining power. So in the past, you can go to your leasing company and say, well, things are not going well for me. Can you renegotiate this lease? And they might say, well, no, why should I do that? I'll just take my planes and put it on the other side of the world where things are going great. Well, there's no place in the world that's going great right now. So everybody's kind of in the same boat. They're all trying to work this through together. So if there's cost that an airline needs to reduce, now's a good time to do it. Even with governments, airlines, why did US airlines get $50 billion worth of government aid singled out, whereas pretty much no other industry was singled out? Well, the reason why is because they have a lot of influence in government. They employ a lot of people. They support a lot of local economies. So lots of bargaining power that airlines have with their stakeholders right now. China, look at that. It's already recovering. It's not back to normal by any means, but people are going back to work. I just saw the city of Wuhan, which is where the COVID-19 originated. They're getting back to work. There are planes flying there again. There's even a few faint signs of recovery in Europe. I was listening to an airport conference call the other day. It was a company that owned some airports in Italy, and they were saying they were starting to get back to normal. Okay, so I think it's just important to remember that after every crisis, you always inevitably have winners that emerge from it. And you can see that after the 9/11 crisis, a lot of LCCs thrived, the Gulf carriers thrived, Chinese carriers. We saw that even after the global financial crisis. So I'll stop there. I'm going to turn it over to Madhu, and he's going to tell you all why everything I just said was complete and utter nonsense.
Right, and Brian, to your point, I forgot my striped tie. So it's
You
not
look great in the jacket, Madhu.
It's not quite high school. But basically, yes. I mean, everything, I think Jay took a very Pollyannish view, and almost everything he said was wrong. I'm lying, of course. But, just based on some of the conversations I've had with people in the industry as I've been reporting this, is the fundamental truth is that air travel demand tracks the economy, and we're seeing the widespread destruction of economies across the world. And whether that's temporary or not, I mean, there's arguments to be made on both sides, but most of the people I speak to about this say that we will not have a V-shaped recovery. In other words, a quick downturn and a quick uptick. That instead, the most optimistic scenario that people seem to forecast is a sort of a shallow U, if you can just imagine, right? Down and then very slow recovery up, or even worse, a double dip, a W, where we have two recessions. So, this is in an industry that tracks GDP. When every region of the world is suffering, it's really unlikely for air travel demand to come back. And this is illustrated really sharply just this morning. In the last 3 weeks in the US, 17 million people have filed for unemployment. And that's levels almost not seen since the Great Depression. So people are out of work. If they're out of work for 1 or 2 months, they're depleting their savings if they had any. And one of the first things they'll start to cancel is their summer vacations. It's very unlikely that a household that's been out of work for 2 months is still going to take that vacation they planned for in the summer or even the early fall, which is when typically airlines make their most money. So it's going to take a while for demand to come back. Corporate travel, I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Corporate travel, companies are getting used to video conferencing. And granted, Jay and I have been joking about this for a while. I mean, we remember when faxes were going to kill corporate travel. And then email was going to kill corporate travel. And it's true, there will always be factories that have to be visited. You have to visit that key client. But it'll be a while, I think, as companies are just struggling to stay afloat or to keep the lights on, that they'll want to start to send their employees to conferences or to visit customers and just find alternatives. So it'll be a while before that comes back. Another thing to remember is that previous crises took years to recover from. It took about 3 years after September 11th. Took a few years after the 2008 financial crisis. And what's different about this crisis is that it's everywhere, right? It's all around the world. And it's both a demand and a supply crisis. There's people aren't traveling and there's just not any capacity, airlines are grounding their fleets. There's just not supply. So it's different. I mean, a lot of the people I talk to say it's going to take a while to come back, but we don't know when it is. And we have never seen anything like this. So, there's a lot of uncertainty in everything, but it's hard to be optimistic, just given the number of years it took to come back from past crises, to think that this one, which is markedly different from anything we've seen, will be any better. To Jay's point, commodity prices are low. I mean, we're seeing, if you've tried to fill the gas in your car recently, even in California, we're seeing prices that are like $2 a gallon, which is shocking. And that's great for airlines. But first of all, no one's flying. Secondly, I mean, the other thing to think about is that countries, commodity exporting countries, are seeing a huge hit to their economies right now. So they're unlikely to start traveling again until commodity prices start to rise. So it's good on the one hand for airlines, but bad in terms of a lot of their customers just may not be flying as much, or companies in those countries. As I said earlier, no region of the world has been spared. After September 11th, that was the transatlantic market, the US market obviously were affected, but networks in, say, parts of Asia or Africa were not as affected. This is different. This is everywhere, right? And it's a much more interconnected world than it was 19 years ago. The other point is that the economy in the US was great before this crisis occurred, before the COVID-19 crisis occurred. But the global economy was showing signs of slowing. China's GDP growth wasn't as strong as it had been in the past. There were trade rows breaking out all over the world, which were affecting commerce. It was unlikely that we weren't in the strongest position going into this, and now things have just been made a lot worse. Regulatory constraints. Countries are instituting travel bans, new visas, restrictions. Will that affect demand? Sure, I'm sure it will. It'll be a long time before those are unwound. I think there's signs from people I've been speaking to, that will come out of this a more protectionist world. So that will definitely have an effect on demand. Regulations. We just saw in the US, there are, with the bailout funds to the airline industry, there are restrictions placed on how much they fly. In other words, they have to keep their service levels at a certain point. Will that be replicated in other parts of the world? Will this mean the airlines are going to be flying, or the governments are going to be dictating how airlines fly? All of this is unclear. But you don't take it from me. I'm just a scribbler. You just have to look at, say, what Lufthansa said this week. Austrian, one of its airlines, predicts that that demand will not start to return to pre-crisis level until 2023. So that's 3 years from now, and that's pretty optimistic. The company Lufthansa Group as a whole has been retiring aircraft and cutting routes, and all of this will take time to rebuild again. And we don't really know what the airline industry will look like on the other side of this. Will airlines be smaller? Probably. What does it mean for airlines that don't have large domestic markets like KLM or Singapore Etihad that depend on long-haul travel, and it's likely that long-haul travel will come back more slowly. So in other words, I think the next couple of years will be rough for the airline industry. It's hard to see what it'll look like, but it's going to be different.
Thanks, Madhu, for that excellent take, and thank you, Jay, for taking perhaps the more challenging side. Again, I am your moderator. I have some questions for you guys, and I'm also monitoring the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen there if anybody has some questions. First, a question for both of you, Jay and Madhu. We promised that we would talk about fleet today. So let's talk about it. You know, after September 11th, the Boeing 727s went away. We didn't see many of those after that. And even after 2008, 2009, we stopped seeing so many 737 classics, except maybe at Southwest Airlines. I'm curious, we have all these airplanes in the desert and just stored at airports worldwide. What are going to be the big airplane casualties of 2020? What airplane are we probably not going to see again fly? Jay, do you want to start with that one? Jay, I think you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, apologize. I'll start with some thoughts on where aircraft markets may be headed. In the past, during crises, we've seen examples of older aircraft coming in vogue again, especially with depressed jet fuel prices. In fact, there have been airlines, some of you that are familiar with today, that have built their business models off of that reality. You can think of a company like Allegiant, for example, but there are more. This time may be different. In fact, I think we already know that it's going to be different because we see some actions that have been taken by airlines already. Some of the older aircraft that you think might get a second life are getting retired, rather early. You think, the 767s, the 757s of the world, even some of the, 737 NGs. And part of the reason why is that some of the newer generation, first of all, are just much better technologically. I mean, they're in so many ways more useful to airlines. Even when fuel prices don't matter. You can think of, just comparing, the A321neo versus, some of the older A320s. They have longer range. Their fuel efficiency, yes, is much better. Their, maintenance efficiency. So there's a lot of reasons. There's also the environmental factor is a big one. That's not going away. Environmental pressures on airlines. So newer aircraft will probably win the day even after this crisis, which is not to say that there may not be an airline or two who is able to craft a unique business model built on older aircraft, but don't expect if you own any old MD-80s or anything, don't expect to get rich off of that.
Do I have a follow-up question for you? The A380, it's not a particularly old airplane. But they've fallen out of favor in recent years. Are we going to see A380s fly over the next 5 years, or is this the end of an era?
It's the end of an era. I mean, the era probably ended before it began, to be honest. You're seeing, I think airlines one airline in particular that has based much of its business model on the A380, the Super Jumbo, Emirates, has more than 100 of the aircraft in its fleet. I think it'll keep flying. It'll bring those back into service. But you see airlines like a lot of the European carriers, Qantas, they've grounded their A380s, and it's hard for me to see, especially if demand is low, that these will be coming back anytime soon.
Great, thank you. All right, I wanted to ask an audience question here. We have one from Linus Benjamin Bauer. Linus wants to know, is there a bright or a dark future for ultra long-haul operations in the post-COVID-19 crisis era? What do you guys think about these ultra-long flights? Are they going to come back, or are we going to go back to stopping in Tokyo if we're on our way to Southeast Asia and things like that?
Is that for me?
Sure, Jay.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. So this is ultra long-haul flying. As distinct, I just want to make a distinction between we're not talking about long-haul LCCs, which I think is a separate question. But in terms of these, just some of these new flights we were starting to see from, Perth to London, for example, and we like to call them ultra long range. Will they be going away? No, those. I mean, we don't know what the industry is going to look like as far as different demand patterns, but these are planes that can accomplish missions that as long as people need to get from Australia to London, which maybe they won't be doing next year or the year after, but presumably if they'll be doing that sometime in the future, those are planes that will have they'll be useful. So no, they're not going away. I mean, those, just keep in mind, ultra long haul flying, even pre-crisis, it is a niche sort of thing. It's not something that you can really build a business model off of anything. If you're in there, Qantas is unique because of the geography, and they can use those for certain routes. But yeah, not going away anytime soon.
And if I can add one thing to that, Brian, it all depends on demand, right? On the one hand, ultra long haul flights tend to be operated by smaller aircraft like the 787 Dreamliner than say the A380, so they're easier to fill. But on the other side of it is, if you read about the travel industry and people looking in their crystal balls, there's a belief that travel, in at least in the next couple of years, people, when they start to travel, are going to stay local. So, will they be hopping on planes to go to Australia, or will they just go to wine country, which is 60 miles away from me? It remains to be seen.
Thank you. If I could just make a quick plea to the audience, you'll notice two icons below your screen. One is for Q&A and one is for chat. I'm really only monitoring the Q&A when I ask these guys questions. It's hard to see both windows at the same time. So if you could ask your questions in the Q&A section, that would be great. We had a follow-up from Frank about our discussion of fleet. Frank wants to know, a very good question, how does all this affect the Boeing 737 MAX? Do you want to take that one, Madhu?
Well, to Jay's point, despite its checkered history, it's a remarkable aircraft, and pilots loved it, airlines loved it. It had great operating economics. Airlines have spent a lot of money ordering these things. I think once it gets through its regulatory hurdles, I don't see the changed airline industry really affecting the uptake of the 737 MAX. It just, of course, it remains to be seen how long it takes and how the fixes will be implemented. But airlines loved the aircraft before it was grounded, and I don't think this, it just makes sense financially.
Madhu, do you think consumers are going to have short memories? There was about a 6-month period that people said, I'm never flying on that airplane. You think when this is over, nobody's going to care?
They've forgotten already. I can guarantee that. I mean, like, I always love talking about the DC-10. I mean, there were people in the late 70s and early 80s who said they would never fly the DC-10 again, and it remained in service until the early 2000s. People forget.
I want to let our hundreds of participants know today. Madhu told me before we started that the DC-10 is his favorite aircraft ever, which surprised me a little bit. But anyways, we've been getting the same question in multiple ways, and I know, Jay, this is a good one for you. A bunch of people want to know which airlines, in your opinion, are going to struggle to come out of this crisis, both in the United States and global. I know, Jay, you have some opinions on this.
Yeah, well, there was a list of distressed airlines even before the crisis began. So you'd have to logically assume that they're the ones that are struggling the most right now, with a little twist. And the twist goes back to something I mentioned earlier, and that's government policy. So you might have had an airline that was on the verge of disappearing before the crisis, and now is gonna be fine for a while because they may have received enormous amounts of government aid. And an example of that would be, it's not a perfect example, but Alitalia. Alitalia was on the verge of going away. The crisis kind of gave the Italian government a mandate to renationalize it. The details of that are not final. They may downsize it, so there's some, some caveats there. But keep that in mind. Government policy could change the equation. But going into the crisis, there were a very large number of airlines that were experiencing lots of distress. Now, you asked about the U.S. Industry in particular. That was a different story. The U.S. industry was extraordinarily stable over the whole last decade, really, and that had to do with a number of factors, but consolidation was a big one for sure. And are there any airlines right now that are experiencing problems that will persist beyond this current downturn? Well, of course, we don't know what the upturn is going to look like. So, if, for example, if domestic and short haul winds up coming back a lot faster than long haul and international, then you'd have to assume an airline like Allegiant or Southwest or JetBlue, airlines with those short haul kind of networks, they would tend to do better than an airline like maybe, United or Delta that has more reliance on long haul intercontinental flying. But that kind of remains to be seen. But just as a kind of broader takeaway, the U.S. airlines went into this crisis very healthy, and as long as government money can sort of keep them flying, through the downturn, however long it lasts, 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is, they should come out of it with severely damaged balance sheets, yes, but in decent shape to take advantage of whatever recovery transpires.
Great, Jay. Thank you. Madhu, I have a question for you because I consider you to be our small airport guru. This one comes from Dean. It's a good one. It's kind of US focused, but what will be the ongoing effects for smaller airports like Atlantic City International that already had limited service before COVID? What's going to happen to these smaller US airports?
Really good question. I mean, part of it, what we saw in the last sort of after September 11th, as the industry consolidated, a lot of really small cities lost service. Granted, there were some that were preserved by government regulation, the Essential Air Service Program, but a lot of the smaller destinations lost their last air service just because there are fewer airlines. This time, it remains to be seen, first of all, how this government regulation will play out. The Department of Transportation has requirements for airlines to continue maintain service to their existing route networks if they take CARES Act funds. I mean, it varies, like the frequency, et cetera, varies. The devil's in the details. But when that expires, will smaller destinations see air service disappear? Yeah, I think it will. I think they will.
Thanks, Madhu. And we were talking about earlier just this idea, people think a flight like Atlantic City to Chicago is about capturing that local demand on both sides. But part of this is about whether people from Atlantic City or any city like that are going to be going on to Tokyo or Shanghai or something like that, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you take in my backyard, there's a flight from Santa Rosa to San Francisco. I think it's a 16-minute flight or something ludicrous like that. It's an hour and a half drive. That flight, though, exists to connect passengers in Sonoma County to Singapore, for example, through San Francisco. So if the number if people in smaller cities are not traveling, airlines know to within they know how many people are traveling between two destinations all over the world, right? To a large degree. So if the traffic from, say, Atlantic City to Milan has dried up, and no one's traveling that way, then yeah, I think that is an argument for not keeping those smaller spokes in the hub and spoke system.
Great, thank you. Just looking for another one here. So there was a question about, a lot of these airlines have come out and said, we're going to take social distancing more seriously. We're not going to sell every seat on the airplane. We're going to block middle seats. Madhu, do you think that this is kind of like a medium-term solution for airlines, or are they only doing that now because loads are so poor it doesn't really matter? Like when you're talking to airline people, Are they like, when things come back, we can't do this anymore, or is this a solution?
Absolutely. I mean, it's to allay people's fears. That's what I'm saying now. Now, granted, we don't know how demand is going to come back, right? I mean, people may still be scared to fly, even when they have the money to fly 6 months from now, until the fears subside. I feel like airlines could keep this little tactic around until people are no longer scared to fly. But yes, right now it's just trying to reassure the 10 people on an aircraft.
Thank you. All right, a question about the ME3, the Gulf carriers from Amin. Do you see any changes to the routes or business models of the Gulf's big three? Will there be any mergers or acquisitions in the Middle East region with other flag carriers or LCCs? Jay, do you want to take this one for us?
Sure. Frankly, it's not a pretty picture. The Gulf carriers are feeling pain in a lot of different ways. One is that they're heavily dependent on intercontinental traffic for their revenues, which, as we've kind of been mentioning, probably will be the sort of the last market to recover by all indications, especially since it may take a while for even some of these restrictions on international travel, these government-imposed restrictions, to lift. That's number one. They tend to be heavily dependent on premium travel. They tend to be heavily dependent on emerging market travel, and emerging market economies are a disaster right now, many of them, because of foreign currency issues and commodity price issues. Speaking of commodity price issues, the Middle East is, a lot of these countries are very oil dependent. Take Dubai, for example, even there, more so than Abu Dhabi, say, there's a little bit more diversification of the economy beyond oil. But what is it diversified into? Tourism. Well, that's not doing well. Real estate. That's not doing well. So it's a very bleak picture. These are airlines, and you have to really, if we had more time, we can go into each one individually. Emirates is certainly not the same as Etihad in terms of its, commercial, the soundness of its business plan and all that, or its commercial opportunities. But in general, these were airlines that were beginning to be very distressed even before the crisis, and that's I think obvious to everybody. For a carrier like Etihad, they've been downsizing a lot, restructuring a lot in the last couple of years, made a lot of decisions that probably to be nice weren't very sound. They kind of bought a lot of junky airlines and wound up losing them a lot of money. But even Emirates, which has been very well managed airline, it's things haven't been so great because of some of those issues we talked about that were present even before the crisis, like oil prices weren't high before the oil crisis, for the current crisis, and we can go on. So it's kind of a negative answer to sum things up.
Thank you. We're going to make a pivot to loyalty in a moment, but before I do that, there are a couple people on here that want to know what you really think, not what you were arguing. Pessimism versus optimism. So Madhu, what do you really think?
I really believe what I was saying. I'm afraid to say. I'm not very bullish on the airline industry recovering quickly at all.
And Jay, what about you?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit more boring in the sense that I don't like to take any strong convictions unless I see, a lot of data, and this thing can go a lot of different ways. But in general, I mean, I do agree with Madhu. It does look bad. I mean, we haven't seen economic hardship to this extent. It's 100 years, maybe even more than that. It's pretty bad out there. By some miracle, well, there'll be a vaccine and this thing goes away in 6 months and everything. I mean, maybe, but I'd have to, if you gun to my head, I say pessimist.
All right, thanks, Jay. Let's see. So it turns out that I am Skift's loyalty guru. So we're going to switch positions here, and Madhu and Jay are going to ask me some questions. Let's do it.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. You're our resident expert on loyalty. So if you hang around airline Twitter or go to the various groups that we all belong to, you see there's a lot of panic and a lot of concern about loyalty programs and what happens to your miles, or will I keep my status? So first of all, can you tell us what are airlines doing in this space? Like it's an important part of their business for sure, but it's also one that's deeply valued by customers. So can you walk us through this, Brian?
Sure. Obviously, this is a remarkable situation, Madhu. You and Jay are talking about airlines might not bounce back for years. I have not been out of my house in like 4 weeks. My kids are not in school. There's a global pandemic running around. And the question that I get most from people is, can I keep my elite status? I mean, this was over weeks. This was insanity. And it shows you how much pull these programs have over people. And in the last week or so, Delta Airlines led the charge. A bunch of airlines have come out and said, if you have status this year, you can keep it for next year. So of course, I'm thrilled. I get to keep my 1K status with United next year. It's completely irrational, but it's something to look forward to. But if you go back for a minute, people think that this is like this great deal and they're so lucky they're not going to have to fly this year. They're going to get their status next year. They're getting something for free. I don't quite see it like that. I take the pessimistic side with Jay and Madhu, and I get the feeling that 2020 is kind of a lost cause for flying. So people think that this is so great right now, but by the time the calendar turns to 2021, people are going to be like, well, of course they gave me the status. There was no way I could travel next year. It kind of reminds me of in early March, JetBlue was the first U.S. airline to pause change fees, and a bunch of people came to me and said, wow, this is so great. We're never going to have to pay change fees again, not really realizing that JetBlue was seeing just a complete drop in demand and they had no choice. I sort of see these airlines that have come out and say, you can keep your status for another year. They have no choice. They see what's going to happen in the future. They see nobody's going to fly this year. And by the time next year comes, it's just going to be obvious that you could keep your status.
All right, so you keep your status, but what's it? I mean, there's different, especially in the U.S., different airlines have responded to this differently in terms of loyalty. Can you walk us through? Can you break it down for us? And why?
I'm not sure, I can break it down exactly, but most of them have taken a pro-consumer mentality towards this. I don't think anybody is surprised that Delta Airlines moved first. They've tried to take care of their customers whenever they could. It's kind of getting kind of to be a broken record in the industry, and it is what it is, where Delta does something and then United follows. That's sort of what happened. There's probably people watching this webinar that say, well, United did it a little differently. They are right, but essentially the idea is the same. I think as I'm speaking right now, American hasn't done anything as far as loyalty for next year. I'm sure they will. Look, these are customers that spend a lot of money on these airlines. And of course, the airlines want to do everything they can to keep them happy. That was a little less the case the last 3 to 5 years, as business was really good for airlines. They kind of turned their back on people that didn't spend at least, $10,000 on them every year. But loyalty is probably going to become more important going forward, because there's people like me that spend my own money that want to fly, and I want to be treated well by the airline. I was kind of not treated as well the last 2 or 3 years because you had all these people at Google and Facebook just spending insane amount of money on travel. But loyalty is going to be important going forward.
Well, this is let's take a question from the audience. Bennett Chen asks, what would you recommend to airlines to attract business travelers back?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting promotions. That's what I'm looking for in 2021. In the past, even the 2008, 2009 crisis, airlines would kind of go with a one-size-fits-all thing. So if you are a business traveler and the airline knew it, you might get double elite qualifying miles, or if things were really bad, you would get triple elite qualifying miles. And then if that didn't work, you would get not the elite qualifying miles, but you get the miles good for the free ticket in the future, these revenue miles. So people love that. But one of the things that I've been covering in the last 3 to 4 years that's interesting is that airlines can now drill down to an individual level. They know what you, Brian, have been doing as far as flying in the last couple of years, and they know what they want you to do in the future. So they can say, not just everyone gets double or triple miles, but Brian, we know that you've been to Singapore for work, 4 times in the last 2 years. If you go to Singapore again, you get this. Or if you fly, this many miles in this period, you get this. So I think everything is going to be sort of much more individualized, and people have talked about the gamification of loyalty, and I think that we'll see that even more going forward.
Explain gamification of loyalty to people like me who don't really know what you're talking about.
Well, you all may know Madhu used to work at United Airlines, which actually did this pretty well, even in a prior era. They have this game called Mile Play, and you can see it on your mobile app. And they'll be like, if you fly 4 times over the next 90 days and each ticket is at least $300, then we will give you some number of miles that looks like they came up with it out of thin air. And it's different than your husband or your wife is getting. It's a different offer. Everybody's getting a different offer. And some algorithm somewhere thinks that you are deserving of 7,300 miles if you do these things. And I just think that we're going to see like a lot more of that. It's almost like, I think it comes from like video games and stuff like that.
Well, I may have worked there. I had no idea that existed. Thank
Really?
you. No.
I bet some of our viewers have played the Mile Play game, and people have actually complained. I confess to this. I read the blog or the website Flyer Talk. People have complained that in the past from United, whatever offer they got was kind of insulting, right? They weren't getting a whole lot of miles out of these Mile Play games. I have a feeling in the future, if you're actually willing to fly, they're going to sweeten it quite a bit for you because they want to get you back on the airplane.
All right, well, I have questions, but let's go on to an audience question. This is actually something I think both of you can answer. And Jay, so does the Linus Benjamin Bauer asks, again, would the COVID-19 crisis have a positive or negative impact on the valuation of loyalty programs of airlines? Jay, do you want to take sort of what you think and sort of the business implications, and I'll turn to Brian about what you see the effect of the pandemic might have on the programs in general.
Okay, so the crisis, the value of the product. No, well, of course, if because the crisis is so deep and demand is so depressed, then of course the value of those programs is diminished quite significantly. Think about, so one of the key drivers behind those values is the ability for airlines to sell the miles to credit card companies is probably the most important buyer. And, do credit card companies, I mean, it's a separate question, if nobody's spending money on their credit cards because of this economic recession / depression, then, do those credit cards even, really pay off for the banks? Do they even bother with the miles? Traditionally they've been extremely profitable for the banks and in turn the airlines. Long term, I have no doubt that when demand does return, the loyalty programs will be, they'll be extremely important as they always were. Keep in mind though, when we're talking, to put things in an international context, the U.S. carriers tend to have giant plans and extremely lucrative plans. There was some jokes after previous crises that, the airlines were just loyalty plans with wings, and that was where a lot of the money was being generated. It's wasn't quite like that pre-crisis, but internationally, it's not always the case. Not everybody has as valuable a loyalty program. They just tend to be not as valuable in a place, pretty much everywhere else in the world, really. The U.S. is where the action is the most. Qantas, for example, is a very valuable one, but and there's plenty of other individual examples, but geographically speaking, in a broad sense, they tend to be most valuable in the U.S. I think that kind of gets at the question.
Brian, what's your take on this COVID-19 having a positive or negative impact on the valuation on loyalty programs, other than the fact that we've been playing Minecraft for miles, apparently?
Well, one interesting thing is that a lot of these US airline contracts with the banks, and that's where most of the money comes from, are very long-term deals. So Delta's contract with American Express goes through 2029. And as long as both of those companies are in business, Delta will see these billions and billions of dollars from that. So it's not going to affect loyalty values necessarily there. The big caveat is in prior crises, we've seen airlines go to their banks and say, I know you were supposed to give us X billion of dollars in 2026, but we actually need that money right now. And they take a discount so that they can get prepayment for miles going forward. One interesting thing is, as far as I can tell, no US airline has done this yet, even though they're very short cash. And I've talked to some people about this, and the mentality is that airlines in the past would always go to these banks as basically a piggy bank for money in advance, and they always regretted it. And it took them years to get out from under this. And now they're finally getting the loyalty values that they were hoping for. Delta's expecting this big, big infusion of cash late in this decade, and they don't want to forego it for cash now. But we're all going to have to see what happens.
Great. Well, that pretty much brings us to time. Jay, Brian, I want to thank you for this interesting discussion, and to all of you who asked questions online. Thank you very much for joining us today on on this webinar and for asking some pretty tough questions. Brian Quinn.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be sharing the recording and slides from this webinar later this afternoon. You can view all of our continuing coverage at skift.com. Thank you, and please stay tuned for our forthcoming online events.